Welcome, everybody, and welcome to this edition, part 2 of a series that we began just a few days ago called Remembering America. This lesson today is one of the most important lessons you will ever hear regarding our beloved United States of America. I know that you love America or you would not be watching this today. So I want you to do me a favor and share this with every patriot that loves this great nation. Because the information you're going to learn today will literally open your understanding as to what's really going on in our nation and what could become of our nation. Time is made up of 3 parts. When you deal with time, you have 3 elements of time. You have the past, the present, and the future. You have yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Those 3 parts are what we call the Trinity of time. Without all 3, you don't have the one called time. So in the United States of America, we have no problem looking at our past. We love our past. We have a wonderful history. And we love our present because in our present, it's been pretty good. Been a bed of roses, to be honest with you. But there is an element in time that we as Americans have a hard time dealing with. It's called tomorrow or the future. Had you gone into the empire of Rome, the world empire known as Rome, and had you talked to the senators of Rome and told them that one day Rome would cease to exist, they would laugh you to scorn, because at that time Rome was the greatest government in existence in history. However, there came a time in the future when Rome no longer existed. As unfathomable as it was in their present, they could not fathom their future. Had you gone to the great monarchs of Great Britain just 100 years ago, and had you spoken of Great Britain in the past tense, had you spoken of the United Kingdom in anything less than grandeur, they would have laughed you to scorn, because it truly was an empire that the sun never set on. It covered every part of the globe, from the small island of Britain to the nation of Hong Kong. This empire was insurmountable to its enemies. But now you and I live in a place that they didn't live in. We live in their future. And there is no British Empire any longer. Why? Because every government in human history makes one of 3 mistakes. And I am here today as Professor Toto to teach you why you must understand the future of America. Now, history is a strange creature, because history always repeats itself. You can depend on it. Why do you think they call it Katrina? Hurricane Katrina was the 100-year hurricane. It comes every 100 years. We can go back into recorded history and we can tell the future by looking at historical events, how they play out. So today in this video, I have titled this series Remembering America, because I'm going to take you now into the future. I want to take you 100 years into our future at a time when you and I have passed away and our grandchildren are alive, but they're old now. And I want to show you that if history repeats itself, what that's going to look like for your grandchildren. They will be sitting around with their grandchildren, talking as old people do, telling their grandchildren about something that existed in history called the United States of America. They will speak of the United States of America as one of the greatest experiments in human history. And then they will tell their grandchildren how that great empire that covered 50 sovereign states and held those states into complete unity for hundreds of years, but how that great empire failed. And they will tell those grandchildren one of three things, the same three things that we can say of every human government. I want to promise you right now, history repeats itself and it will repeat itself. And there is only one way to delay, is to learn from history. And then you can delay the inevitable. But perhaps we can delay it for our great-grandchildren and their grandchildren until eventually there is no more delaying it. But in our generation, we have the power. It's called knowledge and understanding to stop the decline of the United States of America. We are on the path, we are on the trajectory of all world empires. Remember this, every human government is temporary. Always. They never last because we are infallible as human creatures. But every human government in history, they all make the same mistake. Number one, they either consolidate their power at the top. And I explained this to you in part one. If you've not watched part one, you need to go watch it now before you watch this one. In part one, I drew two triangles showing you liberalism and conservatism. And I showed you that on the liberal side, their triangle is right side up. Upside down. They consolidate all their power at the top with a big government. And that is one of three mistakes that every government makes. All the power goes to the top. The next mistake is that they become sovereign over their member states, or they dissolve once they have outlived their usefulness. I want you to focus on that third one. They dissolve. Number one, they either become these monstrosities of a government, very heavy at the top, or they become sovereigns over their states, or they outlive their usefulness. It is my fear that we are actually dealing with all three of those mistakes of government. Over the past several years, since FDR especially, there has been a trajectory to transfer power to the top of our government. When I say the top, I'm referring to the federal government, more explicitly, Washington, D.C. Number two, this top-heavy government is literally becoming a sovereign over the states. And soon they will be to the point where they will outlive their usefulness. And our future will inevitably take us over, where this nation will crumble at its very core. That crumble has already begun. In the 2016 election, we saw the greatest evidence that this government is crumbling. Why? Because we are a republic, which means we are ruled by law, not by the majority. And we saw a colossal failure of the law in the 2016 election. Now, I want you to understand something before we go any further. Many of you watching me right now, you are very afraid of something called globalism. I'm afraid of it. It is where a nation loses its sovereignty, it loses its identity, it loses its culture, its customs, and its borders, and therefore gets swallowed up in an empire or globalism. This is the undoing of every great nation when they lose language, culture, and borders. These are the things that make us sovereign. Now, God set it up that way. If you go to the book of Genesis, you'll find out at one time that all of the nations were one. They built a tower called the Tower of Babel. And the angels of Yahweh came down and divided the nations. And the Bible says that Yahweh set up the boundaries of every nation. Do you know that ever since God separated these nations into 70 nations, do you know that ever since then, man has tried to put them all back together and make one world government, or the United Nations, or the League of Nations? There's this ongoing goal to put back together what God has separated. But that will never happen until our Lord Jesus Christ, Yeshua, returns to set up his government here on earth from New Jerusalem. However, man is trying today, world leaders, elitists, globalists, to bring these nations together. And to do that, they must knock out our individual identity. They must knock out our borders, our walls, our sovereignty, our thinking that we are first or we are number one. They despise that line of thinking. And many of you watching me, you understand what's happening, and you're very afraid of globalism. But in this lesson today, I'm going to teach you that what you're afraid of now is not what you should be afraid of. Because I render to every student watching me today that globalism is not our problem in America. Rather, nationalism is our problem. Allow me to explain. So what is nationalism? It is the enemy of the United States of America. It is the enemy of the republic for which we stand. I'm about to give you an education that will make you one of the strongest debaters for the conservative values of this nation if you will simply learn these principles. 3 words that I want you to learn in this lesson: globalism, nationalism, and federalism. The nation that you live in, the nation that was founded by your founding fathers, was a nation that abides by a system called federalism. I'm going to try to make this so simple that your child can understand what I'm saying. I want you to imagine that there are 2 kings. One king lives in the east, and one king lives in the west. I tell you what, let's make it 3 kings, and one king lives in the south. Now, all of these kings have their own land, their own laws, their own people, and they are sovereign. These 3 kings are absolute sovereign and individual. However, these kings, sometimes they get along, sometimes they don't. They have people that live in their kingdom that's got family that lives in the other king's kingdom, and they can't go visit with their family without some kind of a permission to cross over the border. And these 3 kings realize that they need to find a way to get along. They need to find a way to be able to sell goods to one another without charging taxes for crossing into their border. They need to find a way to come into a more perfect union than just being neighbors with adjoining land. So they get together and they say, we've got to find a way to work together, guys. And they say we need to form a more perfect union. Now, we're not going to give up 1 ounce of our sovereignty or our individuality. We're still going to be 3 separate kings with 3 separate kingdoms. But we need to create another entity that will ensure that all three of us can work together. So what is their solution? They decide to create another kingdom. The only thing about this kingdom, it's not going to have any people in it. It's only going to have another king. And they're going to call that kingdom the Kingdom of the North, or the Kingdom of Washington, D.C. Whatever they choose to name this king, it is a separate entity created by these three kings. And these three kings, literally, they find a man, they put him on the throne, and they say to him, you are now the king of the north. And we three kings are going to sign a piece of paper granting you very limited power over us. Mr. King, your role is limited. Your job is to be there to make sure that we all three can identify not just by our own dominion, but we can actually identify under you as all of our kings. But, Mr. King, don't ever think that you have power over us except for the power we are granting to you in this Constitution. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what I just told you is exactly what happened. That is called federalism, where these governments of these sovereign independent nations, we call them states here in America, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, we call them states, but in fact they're nations. They have their own king or president. He's called a governor. And all 50 of these governors found themselves in the same, well, actually, at the beginning, there was 13 of those presidents or nations, colonies, kings, whatever you want to call them. The principle remains the same. They all 13 realized they needed each other, but yet they did not want a monarch. So they decided to create an entity, but not a king. They wanted to create something different. This time, what they created was called a federal government. Why did they call it that? Because of federalism, which is the doctrine of the conservatives that we're teaching you in the conservative college. This is what I preach in every program, and this is what you and your children must learn, is this principle of federalism. Now, when they created the federal government, I'm going to read to you, when these 13 kings or governors came together, here is what they wrote concerning what they created, called the federal government. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, and to ensure domestic tranquility, and to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Up until that was written in 1776, there was no such thing as an entity called the United States of America. There was the colony of Virginia, the colony of the New England colonies, the Massachusetts colony. There were 13 nations. They came together to form that perfect union, and from that written document, they created an entity called the federal government. Now that you understand federalism and what that means, let's go back again to the future, where we were at the beginning of this class, where your grandchildren are telling their grandchildren of what went wrong in the United States of America. And they're going to tell your great-great-grandchildren that the United States of America lost federalism. And when the grandchildren say, well, how did it happen? They will say to them, because they allowed their original focus, their original creation to morph into something else. Now, what is that something else? It's called nationalism. All of my life, because I wasn't taught any different in school, I considered myself an American, a proud American, and always really thought of this nation as one nation under God. But that is a very tricky phrase that really doesn't mean what you think it means. It comes from the Latin phrase, e pluribus unum. Here's what we mean by one nation. Let's make it real simple. Let's talk about one church. Do you have a local church in your town? All right. It's one church, okay? But inside of that one church, it's made up of many people. Let's go to school. Let's say one class. That's one class. But yet there would be no class if it were not for the many people in the class. The United States of America is one in the same fashion. We are not one as in giving up our separateness or giving up our individuality. Our states are one because of the Constitution. If that Constitution was to be shred today and we were to decide we were no longer going to go by that Constitution, it would go back to the 50 states and we would no longer be one. It's just like a marriage. Me and my wife, we're one, but we're totally separate entities. The United States of America is made up of 50 kings, 50 governors, 50 groups of people. And when we lose sight of that, then we start looking towards Washington, D.C. as our great seat of government. But the truth is, the greatest seats of government in the United States of America is your governor and your state legislature. But we have lost focus on that, and we're so focused on presidential elections because we really think we are just this national government. And that is why the conservative cause is losing everywhere we turn, because we have lost focus that all politics are local. So I hope that you understand from this lesson today that you can delay the future of America, the demise of America, by realizing that you're the great citizen of whatever state you're from. Get focused on your state, your local, your state government. That's where your focus must turn to, because it is these state legislatures that hold the federal government in check. So before I go today, let's go again back to the future. Let's sit in that living room with that great-grandfather that might be your grandchild today, as he's telling his grandchildren the rest of the story. By the time they come along, some other government will have been created, hopefully a better government than what we have even now. And those grandchildren might ask the grandfather, "Grandfather, how are we a better government than the United States of America was?" And he will probably say to them, "Because when we created this new government, whatever it may be called, we wrote down and put in our new Constitution certain guarantees, children, that what happened to the United States would never happen again." And they might say to him, "Well, grandfather, what is that protection?" And he would say to them, "It's 14 principles that we learned from the late United States government. We saw where they dropped these principles. We saw where these principles were a little muddy and they weren't really written down, perhaps, like they should be. But we learned from them. And in this new government, we have created these 14 principles that will make sure that we never go down the path that the United States government went down. Now, what are those 14 principles? I'm going to teach them to you in the next few lessons. In part 3, that'll be upcoming, of Remembering America, we're going to start going through the principles that you need to teach your children and your grandchildren. Now, before I go, I don't want you to be discouraged and think that there's no way to stop this. There is. You're watching right now the way to stop it. We must re-educate our children, our grandchildren, to these principles, that we are a republic, that our federal government is to be held in check by the states that we are citizens of. Take pride in your state again. Me, I was born in Louisiana, and I'm proud to be born in Louisiana. I'm now a citizen of Mississippi. So I take great pride in being a citizen of the great state of Mississippi. That's why your senators are so important. They are in the Senate representing your state. Ladies and gentlemen, what you have learned in this lesson is the difference in globalism, nationalism, and federalism. Forget globalism. We need to get rid of nationalism. We must return to state sovereignty, state pride, and still give respect to our federal government, but take pride in our state government, our state flag. We must become federalist again. That is our only hope of saving this nation from the 3 things that happened to every government. What were they again? Too much power goes to the top, or they become sovereigns over their states, or they outlive their usefulness. Don't let it happen to us. The power's in your hand. You can educate your family right now. You can put them in front of this video. Do you know you could share this lesson with your groups that you're a part of, and you could help stop the demise of this nation? Why? Because knowledge is power. Education is the secret to saving America. Not arms, not getting out there and fighting with violence, but fighting with voices and education. Has this lesson earned your trust? Then why don't you subscribe to our channel? We need you to subscribe. YouTube doesn't like our voice too much, and they do take away many of our subscribers, and they don't notify you when we put up a new video. So please go and subscribe now and click that notification bell. Share this. And before I go, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. So many of you send us the kindest gifts in the mail. You send us love offerings to our local church where we pastor. You will never know what that means to us. We never ask you for anything. We never have. We never will. But it would be remiss of me not to stop and thank you for your kindness. I am your neighborhood professor, Professor Toto, and it was my privilege to teach you today about Remembering America, Part 2.